Aloha, Starseeds and magical friends, and welcome to episode 7 of the Rachel Z Project podcast. And on today's episode, we are going to talk all about the freedom to travel, as well as the Charter of the Forest. Fun fact, in 2015, the Charter of the Forest, which is the companion document to the better-known Magna Carta, toured the country of Canada, which marked its 800th anniversary, making stops in Ottawa, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Edmonton. And in my last episode of the Rachel Z Project podcast, I mentioned that on today's episode, we are going to talk all about the 2 times I made my way across this great white north. The latest one being when myself and my husband Kevin and Wolfie drove to Winnipeg last summer to retrieve the original Dragon Warrior's handwritten manuscript. But what do these stories about traveling across the country have to do with the Charter of the Forest? Oh, a whole lot. And so let's get right into it. The Charter of the Forest. The Charter of the Forest was a companion document, arguably the more important document that guaranteed free men access to the forest. Previously with the Magna Carta, this was mainly concerned with the power struggle of the barons with the king. And a quote from my research is, regarding the Magna Carta, is that we are imperfect humans and we are never going to get there. But the Magna Carta can be seen as a statement of goals, because goals are never realized. They instead point us towards our better selves, and they suggest why we need law to set our better natures against our word. Now that's a loaded statement. The last one about the rule of law is an interesting one, because when the Magna Carta was passed way back in the day, 800 years ago, it only really concerned the power struggle between the barons and the king, and the fact that these barons didn't want to be paying all this stuff to the king, and the king was like overreaching his power, and so it concerned all of that. But what did this have to do with free men, like regular old people? And when I was looking into the Charter of the Forest, this is kind of where the mythos of Robin Hood and his merry men and Maid Marian come from. Because while the Crusades were happening, while King Richard was off on the Crusades, we had the evil King John in his place. Basically, if anyone was hunting in the forest, in any of the crown forests, then King John would cut off their limbs. And so this is not so far from the true facts of what was actually going on in medieval England at the time. Because even after the Magna Carta was passed, there were still aspects of the way that the crown and nobility did things. For example, if you had a patch of forest, just like, let's say, in Canada, where we have all of this amazing provincial forest land, this is all considered crown land right now. I'm going to get back to why that's problematic in just a moment. But back in medieval England, they had these forests, which the king just decided to call, these are my forests now, crown forests. And if you, Joe Schmo over here, were living there and had a little stead and you had a couple pigs and they were grazing in the forest, well, that's trespassing. And so I'm going to come over there and I'm going to detain you, punish you, maim you, whatever, because it's illegal. Now, this was no bueno. So for about 2 years, I think after the Magna Carta, there was this madness until finally we had this young boy king. So the same king who signed off the Magna Carta was not the same king that signed off on the Charter of the Forest. This was a young boy king who was supported by, I forget the knight's name. I will link to it or have a bit of a voiceover or a little bit of a link to it, but he's kind of like the OG of chivalry and chivalrous knights and the idea of having a code of honor, because this knight essentially protected this boy and said that I will stand by this boy's true birthright to the throne. And from that point, the boy knew that to secure loyalty, he had to have, the support of his people. And so the Charter of the Forest was born, which in it, there are some very powerful statements about how we, as human beings, as free men, noble or not noble, are stewards. We are guardians of the forest, as opposed to any one being having ownership on it and then taxing people or charging people for using it. Instead, as long as I am not infringing on my neighbor or stealing from my neighbor or wrecking the forest in any kind of way, that we all can benefit from the resources of the forests of the earth. And so it's been really interesting lately as it comes to freedom, to the land, and who owns the land. Because yes, we are a Canadian country, and as a result, we are part of something called the Commonwealth, which is the fact that we are a crown corporation. And so if we go all the way back to the Charter of the Forest, as opposed to the Charter of the Rights and Freedoms, there are much more powerful statements there about every free man has the right and freedom to make their stead in the forest. And this goes down to like trespassing laws and things like that, where is there really a reason for those laws? And going back to that original quote about how the Magna Carta really was about how we want to be pointing towards our better selves. And if laws are passed to instead just serve the interests of certain noble or monarchy or crown situations, that's not necessarily serving our human family. And so the Charter of the Forest stands still as a document that represents that. And I'm going to do a lot more, highlights on the Charter of the Forest and how we can use the language in that document, which the Magna Carta is also known as the Great Charter, the Master Charter. And so when we're talking about our personal liberties and our personal freedoms, it's important to also arm ourselves with the intel of those who have come before us, who have fought this fight. Okay, so I think I've given enough background to what the Charter of the Forest is all about. It also comes down to, if anyone's seen the anime movie Princess Mononoke and the great forest spirit, the great spirit of life, and how we, as human beings, we are the stewards and guardians of that spirit. So I'm not going to get into too much detail of that right now, because there's a whole series I think I want to make about that and how I call Wolfie our great wolf spirit.
I don't have any more. I just got the poop in my hand. Wolfie, come here.
Wolfie.
Treat.
Wolfie.
He's just loving, he doesn't get to do this often.
The freedom.
And how pets and other beings rise in consciousness as a result of your relationship with them. Okay, so that was about that. Let's get into the sister road trip across the country first, before I get into the secondary Winnipeg trip. So please comment if you've ever done a road trip across a country, even in the US, because there's the, I think Gareth Emery has a whole album just about the road trip that you would take from New York City to LA or vice versa. Okay, so the sister road trip across the country. In October of 2017, it could have been 2018, my memory is not the greatest anymore, I flew to Vancouver to take a road trip with my sister and her fur baby Dash and all of her stuff to come to Toronto. My sister is a brilliant video game developer or programmer. I have to double check with her with the terminology and the NLP that she prefers. But she's brilliant. She's a brilliant, she's a brilliant developer, but not just that, because as it comes to, I was a digital project manager actually. And so I worked with a lot of developers, a lot of different systems engineers, software engineers. Actually, nurse is a brilliant software engineer. I'm just going to put that out there. Anyways, we thought it would be quite the experience to drive from Vancouver through Banff, make a little stop in Winnipeg, and then continue on to Toronto for her to start her new job there. Our father was really against said plans because we were planning on it in early October, and I'm going to get into why we completely underestimated the power of Mother Nature as we were doing this, but our father was really against said proposed plans, even as we were planning it out. Granted, yes, as I said, it was in October that we were planning this, early October, so we thought that we would be in the clear for most of the crazy snow stuff. We were wrong, but more about how we underestimated the weather in our trip a bit later. We broke up the trip into about 12-hour increments where we would alternate every 3 to 4 hours. So depending on the day, either I would start first or she would start first, and we would drive for as long as we could. So about 3 to 4 hours, and then we would switch drivers back and forth. And you would think that you would be able to sleep being the secondary driver, but you kind of feel like I can help in some sort of way. But first, when we took off from Vancouver, we went to Kamloops first, which is actually kind of like a shorter drive, 6 to 7 hours. But actually, even before that, we had to finish packing all of Narissa's stuff and fit it into this Toyota minivan. Fun fact, I used to drive a huge Ford Aerostar minivan. And so back in the day, I used to pick up my friends from dance practice or to dance practice or to the club in this huge Ford Aero Mini-Star van. And so I got very used to driving a big vehicle. It's very empowering. R.I.P. Ford Aerostar. You eventually just died on us, I think. And now, to be fair, in spite of the rain to Kamloops, it was not necessarily a bad drive. It was about 8 hours, a shorter one than the ones that I'm going to talk about very shortly. After we drove to Kamloops, first of all, we stayed at a hotel in Kamloops that had a gym. And so, of course, myself and Narissa had to get in a workout. I will include that little workout as well. I was actually prepping for a show, I believe. I was prepping for a show with my friend Pastel. It was actually my last fitness show, and I consider it my retirement as well. But going back to our road trip, after Kamloops, we left to go to Banff. And I think that this drive from Kamloops to Banff was probably the most beautiful. We had atmosphere that looked like Lord of the Rings. It looked like such a mystical, magical place. And to realize that this is within our great country, epic, absolutely epic. Dash was with us the whole time, and he sat in my lap while we would drive through. When we got to Banff, we stayed in a really cute hotel. Side note, Banff is really expensive as opposed to other places in Canada. It's a very touristy place. I do still recommend it. We stayed in Banff the night, and then the next day we drove to Winnipeg. Yeah, so this is the crazy part. Actually, there's 2 crazy drives. The drive from Banff to Winnipeg, and then the drive from Winnipeg to Wawa. Okay, so first of all, we are prairie girls, as I mentioned. I'm a prairie girl. I'm from the prairies. And if you've ever drove anywhere like through the prairies, it just looks like a flat nothing. So compare this to driving in BC or even kind of through Alberta as you're coming out of BC, because you have the mountains, right? You have like these winding trails, you have scenery. And so when you drive towards the prairies, there's nothing there. And so we drove from Banff to Winnipeg in one day. We left at 6 or 7 in the morning from Banff, and we drove south, and we ended up accidentally getting trapped in Calgary morning traffic, and there was a snowstorm. I remember this. It was like, why is there snow in Calgary? Don't you have like Chinooks and stuff? Why is it like this? Oh, Winnipeg only has it, but it gets worse in terms of the weather. So we get trapped in the Calgary traffic when we take this as an opportunity to make a stop and gas up and reconfigure ourselves, because once we get past Calgary, the snow kind of clears up and we end up on that prairie drive where you kind of feel like you're like losing your mind because you're just going and everything just looks the same as you're driving. So we drove straight through to Winnipeg. I think we arrived really, really late. I have never been so happy to see Welcome to Winnipeg in my entire life. Driving there, it took forever. We realistically probably should have stopped in Regina, but I was like, why am I going to have a night? Why would I have a night in Regina when I can just go home to Winnipeg? So when we were in Winnipeg, we stayed a full day. So in terms of planning of that road trip, this is why we had to push really hard, was because we wanted to stay the full day in Winnipeg before traveling outward. As luck would have it, when we were in Winnipeg, we had a snowstorm or an ice storm or something like that. And so our parents were like, are you like actually going to like leave? I'm like, yeah, we're on the schedule. So we left from Winnipeg, and a lot of, I think, our friends who were there were like, you guys are nuts. Like so because as we were driving out of Winnipeg towards Kenora, and it's a really beautiful area called Lake of the Woods between, it's a 2-day drive from Winnipeg to Toronto. And when you kind of go from Toronto towards Kenora, there's like this place called Falcon Lake I used to camp at with my girls in the summer. But it's a really beautiful drive. Not so beautiful when you're afraid of dying.
Nurse is doing great. Fucked up. That's basically it. Fucked up.
As this was completely treacherous for us. This is the drive where we were like, holy cow, are we going to make it? Because we had our hype. Anyways, I'm going to start from the beginning of this trip. Leaving Winnipeg, there were already semi-trucks in the ditch as we were leaving the city. So we couldn't exceed, I think, the speed of like 60 kilometers an hour as we were moving, which of course, if you take into account driving time, it now meant that no, we weren't going 110 kilometers an hour. Instead, we're going 60. And so we got to Wawa very late. So Wawa is a 14-hour drive from Winnipeg, and Wawa is known as like the city of waterfalls. And we didn't stay in Wawa, kind of sketchy in that city, but we stayed in like a cute little cabin outside of Wawa. And this place was actually quite beautiful. But the drive, as we were going around Lake Superior, we hit a snowstorm, and Nurse and I, because it was a rental vehicle, did not know how to turn our high beams off for a very long time. And so it just looked like a horror movie with all of the snow coming at us. We couldn't see the road. We were like beside Lake Superior. And if you've ever drove through the twisties in Northern Ontario, yeah, we did that in October, early October, and we survived, but that was very traumatic. But Nurse and I were very calm about it. And at the end of the day, whenever you're facing up against, it's a very humbling experience, because all of our technology, all of the stuff that we have, and Mother Nature can still do her thing, right? I probably do not have any video footage of that traumatic drive from Winnipeg to Wawa. Maybe a little bit, just because it was so exciting to survive. So I probably have some celebratory pictures. Now, the drive from Wawa to Toronto was less stressful. It still took much longer than I anticipated, but this all prepared me for the trip that we took last summer when we drove from Toronto to Winnipeg and back again. So this trip accumulated with myself and my sister, Narissa, arriving at the storage locker in Toronto really, really late again. And that's something to note if you're planning out road trips. Remember that if you're traveling later on in the year, that there's such a thing as the sun setting early. So if you're driving in the summer, the sun would normally set, let's say, at like 8 p.m. But when you're driving in October, every day you're losing daylight. And so we would end up having to drive at night, starting at like earlier and earlier every night, which wasn't great. So it was, it was something to note in the future. But when we drove in the summer, that was a different thing that impacted how that road trip kind of was. So that was the story of our sister road trip from Vancouver to Toronto. I ended up being next door neighbors with my baby sister for a couple years, which was a really fun time of my life. She's now back in Vancouver, and I am planning on moving out west. So I think that trip just kind of showed us as well, like what two little girls from the prairies are made of. We did it. We freaking did it. We drove from Vancouver to Toronto in less than a week. Okay, so now we're going to move on. We're going to move on to the second road trip, which is the road trip I prefaced in my last episode of this podcast about the Dragon Warriors. So last summer, the summer of 2022, myself, Kevin, and Wolfie, we drove to Winnipeg. We stayed in an Airbnb there that had a gym in the basement, as well as our Soma supplements. So all of our Formula 1 and Formula 2, we took along with us. We didn't have Formula 3 just yet. And so it was a way, I have a really wonderful story here about my granny and this look that she gave me when I gave her the Soma supplement, because there was this feeling of she's been waiting for me to figure myself out this whole time, and this recognition. But that's a side story I think that deserves its own takeaway. This is about us retrieving the manuscript. We drove over, and my dad, because my dad is my dad, he holds on to everything. And one day while we were in Winnipeg, Kevin and my dad hung out upstairs, and I went down into the basement where he had all these boxes from my room when I left Winnipeg all those years ago with 2 suitcases. I just left all my stuff in the room, and my dad packed everything up because he had moved houses. And so looking through all of this stuff was such a trip. I went to school for English and psychology, and I found a lot of old textbooks from both of these practices that are very relevant to now. And I will be making podcasts about that, including neurolinguistic programming, which at the time I was taking a course called Language and Thought, as well as behavioral endocrinology, which is the study of hormones and how they impact your emotions, your mood, and your mental state. Very relevant to now, right? And so I found through all these boxes an old handwritten, it's like, I'll probably put a picture of it here. And on the front I have like boobs drawn because that was my sense of humor. But it's part 2. It's the Dragon Warriors on Mount Olympus is the story I wrote, because each of the Dragon Warriors has a goddess guardian. So for example, my goddess guardian was Freya Friday, right? And we'll get into that in just a moment, because that's about how we ourselves are all superheroes. But remember, all superheroes have different abilities, and it's in our best interest to kind of know which abilities flow with us more, instead of kind of forcing maybe another ability that isn't for us, and we are probably something so much better at something else. But a lot of that comes with a lot of work from the beginning, of groundwork and figuring all of that out. And so bringing this back to retrieving the original manuscript that was handwritten to now inform my current Dragon Warriors novel, we have a crazy story of, we got the manuscript, I packed up a box of all of little Rachel's things that I was going to use now here in Toronto, and driving back about 3 hours outside of Toronto, there was a crazy accident, and we were stuck on the highway with no reception for about 3 or 4 hours.
So we're trapped not just outside of Sudbury, on the way to Toronto, about 3 hours away, and we are stuck in traffic, as you can see. We've been here for, I don't know how long.
Almost a half hour, I
20
would say.
minutes. Wolfie's taking it like a pro, sleeping. But it's been a long time. And also, we have no reception, so we can't actually post this. We don't actually know what's going on. Football, taking the dog out on the side. Beautiful day.
Left Sault Ste. Marie pretty early, and yeah, we thought we were going to make it in time for dinner. No. we're not home in time for dinner. We instead arrived around the same time me and Narissa arrived into Toronto. You know, like the big lights. I always like, that's the big thing when you come into Toronto. You see the freeway and the lights and the CN Tower, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm home now. And I think this last road trip coming back, having to sit on the highway, there was like everyone, it was kind of fun too, in the sense of like I got to chat with like some of the kids who were like all loved Wolfie. Wolfie was such a trooper through all of this too, so well behaved. He's made for the road. As long as he's got like air conditioning and his like family, he's great. But we were like on the side of the road forever. There was like a Tesla parked a couple of cars in front of us. We're like, are you going to make it? And because that's the thing to think about with electric cars. You're just out there in nowhere. And how does a road trip work with that? And it is our freedom to be able to traverse this great country. We are her children, and to be able to just go and have the freedom to not just drive, just travel, to explore her, to get to know nature, and not in a weird hippie tree hugging kind of way, even though hugging trees is good for you, but more from a practical sense that no one has the right to tell you where you can go, especially if you're not hurting anybody or if you're just trying to make your way for you and your loved ones. I'm not going to keep rambling. I am not going to keep rambling on about it, because I think the message is pretty prevalent just from the beginning, talking about the Charter of the Forest and the freedom to travel and get to experience her, get to experience the greatness of what nature is and what we are as cosmic beings in this 3D realm, in the cosmic grid of the universe. And so I hope you have enjoyed episode 7 of the Rachel Z Project, the freedom to travel, and the Charter of the Forest. And I hope that you have retrieved some useful intel and knowledge from this podcast. Hopefully, this will be dropping right on time on Monday. And so next week, I will be talking all about, well, I am actually going to hopefully be interviewing my husband, Kevin, next week about ceremonial use of psychedelics. So that will be a fun topic. I will be working with him on that. And if that doesn't come next week, it'll be the week after, just working on it. But if you have any questions about the Dragon Warriors and you want to be in on this collaboration, especially if you are an artist, dancer, any of those things, I'm going to be launching Gold and Sugar TV, which is a space for creator beings with no limits for you to express your inner world and your creativity and art, because that is so needed right now for you to be playing out your role in the universe at the highest level that you can. Okay, Starseeds, I hope you have a beautiful day, beautiful evening, wherever you may be, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.